the satin stitch. Now I'm going to tie this off and get a new piece of thread because it does take a lot of thread to do the satin stitch. So when I tie off, and I don't know that we talked about this last time, I do this whether I have the thin thread or the embroidery thread. I actually make a knot in the same way that I made the French knot. I hold my thread out to the side, I wrap the thread around the needle 3 times, I pull it through with my thumbnail on the knot so that the knot lands right against the fabric. So you can imagine what happens if your knot's way out here. Somebody tell me.
It'll come loose.
Yeah. Yeah, your stitching on the front is either going to bubble up, or if you're stitching 2 things together, they can just pull apart. So you want the knot to be right next to the fabric, so that just means that your stitching is secure. Okay. Now with the thread, whether you're using embroidery floss or your thinner thread, I recommend not working with more than a yard at a time. You may have found this out the hard way if you got yourself a really long piece of thread last time, because if you have too much, it can really easily just get tangled up. So you're trying to pull it through, and all of a sudden there's like this big wad on the back, and you can't work it out because you accidentally pulled it taut while you were trying to pull the needle through. That is usually due to just kind of having too much thread to reasonably work with. So if you keep the length under a yard, or here I probably have 24 inches of thread to work with. You can always tie it off on the back and start a new thread. You won't be able to tell on the front, but you don't want to make it too hard for yourself. So the satin stitch is used to fill in shapes. I'll show you in the book. This is the example of the satin stitch. So this you want to do with embroidery floss. You don't want to try to do this with the skinny little thread. It'll just take ages. So you're going to come from underneath, just as with all of these stitches, and you're going to use a back stitch to outline the shape that you're going to fill in. So if you remember the back stitch from last time, you make 1 stitch forward, you come up as if you're going to do a running stitch, and remember to keep these less than 1/4 inch apart. Now, instead of stitching forward and continuing the running stitch, I go back down in the same hole that ended this last stitch. So I'm filling in the space where there would be a space between 2 stitches. I'm just filling it in. So that, if you remember from last time, of course, that can be a type of line stitching that you use on its own if you want to outline something and have kind of a thin line. I actually used it here. I did some parts of my lines with running stitch, and then I did some areas with back stitch to just create some variation. I was treating this just like mark making, almost like if I were doing hatching with a pencil, except a lot more time consuming. So I thought about making, I don't know, a few little darker areas. I put the knots on the top to maybe add a little texture, but then I back stitched in certain areas just to vary the line a little bit. So you can sketch really lightly in pencil, or you can use a chalk pencil that'll wipe off of the fabric if you wanted to outline a particular shape. And you don't want the shape to get too huge. This works better if it's maybe 1 inch across or less, at least for that portion. That you could do the design one section at a time. So I'm kind of stitching around part of this little shape that's just already here. So this shape is outlined. And now what the satin stitch does is I'm going to stitch across and over this entire shape, all the way like from the outside of this edge to the outside of this edge. So when I'm doing with the little pointy end here, that stitch is not going to be very long. But as I work my way across the shape, and this would be true with the circle in this example too, the first stitch that you make is going to be shorter. You want the stitches to be parallel to each other, and they're going to become kind of longer as you work your way across. Now the way that I do this is actually to space them out just a little bit. I'll show you what I mean just a second. So rather than trying to make these stitches that I'm making across this whole shape, rather than trying to make them so that there's no space in between them, I'm actually going to concentrate more on getting them to be parallel to each other, and I'm going to allow there to be a little bit of a space in between them so that I can keep them really straight. Then after I work my way across the shape, I'm going to come back and I can fill in those spaces, and to me it kind of just makes it a little easier to keep the whole thing tidy. So I bring my needle up, remember, on the outside of the outline. I come across, and if you need to use your needle as a guide to make sure that the stitch is parallel to the last one, do. Okay, so say for demo's sake that I've worked my way all the way across the shape. Now you can see here why an inch maximum works best, because see how long this stitch is? This is, you know, maybe half an inch here. If I have a shape that is really long and I have one stitch that goes all the way across, it becomes something that's very loose and the thread can kind of shift around. So you want to keep it kind of short. So let's say I worked my way all the way across. I'm going to come back across the shape. I'm going to bring my needle up so that my stitch lines up just where there's this empty space between these two. And I'm going to fill it in. See how that makes kind of a solid shape? So this is going to be pretty bold, kind of like the French knots is going to create a lot of dimension on the surface. If you were to isolate or pick out some little shapes that came out of your dyeing and cover them in satin stitching, that would create this effect almost like an island kind of floating on a map or something. That can be really interesting. It can add some actual texture because it does become very dimensional. So again, that's the satin stitch.